My name, Gary Heseltine, and a bit about my background for those that don't know me. Put your hand up if you've never heard of me. That's quite a lot. Where have you locked these people up? Right, for the people who don't know me, I was in the Royal Air Force Police for 6 years. I guarded nuclear weapons for 3 of those 6 years. Then I joined the police, and I was a 24-year career in the police. The last 19 years of which was as a detective, constable. Didn't want to go higher because I liked interviewing. That was my particular bag, and didn't like petty politics the higher you went up the chain. So I stayed at the sharp end interviewing murderers, robbers, etc. I was an advanced interviewer of suspects and witnesses, and so I've collectively got 30 years of policing experience. I think I know what evidence is and what would be held up in court as law, what would be an exhibit, how things would be presented, etc. So I look at things very evidentially. Unfortunately, in the UFO subject, it's unregulated, and there is a wealth of material out there that may be true, but there's very little evidence to say some of it is true. And that's a downside, and that's because it's been deemed a fringe subject for decades, because it's been stigmatized. Do I believe that some UFOs are real, as in probably extraterrestrial? Yes, 100%. Do I believe that there is a contact going on in terms of abductions, experiences? Absolutely, yes, there is. Maybe 10% people who are, shall we say, drawn to it because they want to be psychologically drawn to something, they feel lost out. But 90% of the people who claim to have been abducted, I think, are absolutely sincere. It sounds incredible, but I know people from all over the world. In my public UFO career, which began in January 2001, when I launched an unofficial national database for UK police officers called the Proof Force Police Database. I was still a serving detective, so it was very unusual for somebody like me to come out from an evidential side and say that these things are real. But I now have over 550 cases going back to 1901 involving over 1,100 British police officers. When I launched that database, I'd never done any public speaking at all. And it was then a surprise, and something that I didn't anticipate was that groups like Miles and other people around the country would ask me to give lectures about the police cases. So that's how I became known. And fortunately, well, unfortunately for you maybe, but fortunately for me, that when I was asked to do public speaking, I found it was like a duck to water. It was something that I could naturally do. Don't know where that skill came from, but it's something I could naturally do and feel comfortable. Most of my colleagues would have ran a mile to get anywhere near in front of a crowd or a TV camera. But for me, it comes very naturally, and I don't know where that comes from. So, as my career has progressed, in 2010, I was awarded what's called the PRG Disclosure Award. Anybody heard of the American lobbyist Steve Bassett and his PRG group? It's effectively the unofficial World Disclosure Award for my work with police officers. So I got that in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. And from that point on, I was then, in a sense, asked to do international lectures, and I've now lectured in 21 countries around the world. So I feel extremely lucky to be doing what I'm doing. I retired from the police in 2013. 6 years early, because I felt compelled. I can't explain it, but I felt compelled that it was the right time for me to retire from the police. I'd acquired with my RAF service 27 years of a 30-year pension, so I looked at my figures and decided, yeah, I'm going to do it now because something's telling me to do it. And I launched an unofficial magazine, not in print, because I looked at the print costs and they were just too exorbitant in 2013. So it's an e-zine, and I produce a 96-page bi-monthly, every 2 months, PDF. It's a magazine that reads on all your tablets. It's designed for smartphones, etc. And you just read it on your tablet or your Kindle or whatever. But that goes all over the world, and I have some of the best writers in the world, researchers, write for the magazine, because there's as the more well-known I've become, the more international people I've met. So I've pretty much met everybody in the subject who's out there. In a recent development, in June of last year, 2022, I was asked to give a presentation before the Brazilian Senate. You've heard of the American Senate and the Congress. I was asked to give a lecture to the Brazilian Senate. So politicians, basically, senior people in Brazil, one of the countries that Tina mentioned. And I gave a presentation there along with 8 other researchers, 7 of whom were Brazilian. And the only other foreign speaker was somebody called Robert Salas, who was American. If you've ever heard of Robert Salas, he's the guy who in 1967 was underground when his nuclear missiles were switched off. All right, 10 nuclear missiles were switched off when he was in his underground bunker. And that's a very significant case. So I've met Robert on several occasions. He's also spoken at an international conference that I've organised in the past. A more recent development from that is that I'm the vice president of an international NGO, non-government organisation, not-for-profit, and what that is, it's ISA, International Coalition for Extraterrestrial Research. This is made up of scientists, academics, and leading UFO researchers from around the world, and we now have national representatives in 30 countries. So you're probably not even aware of these international developments that are going on in recent years. So that's where I am now. So I spend a lot of my time now in Zoom meetings, talking to diplomats behind the scenes. You talk about people like Chris Mellon, Luis Elizondo, if you're aware of those names, Ryan Graves, people like that, Jacques Vallée. I'm talking to all of those people who are at the upper echelons of this subject. So in a sense, I'm quite well connected now. But one of the things that you should know is that because I served in the Royal Air Force, and for 3 of my 6 years I guarded tactical nuclear weapons at a place called RAF Honington in Suffolk, and then also at RAF Larbruck in what was then West Germany for 3 of my 6 years. So when we talk about the Rendlesham Forest case, now, because there's a lot of people, I think, new to the subject in the audience, just put your hand up in the air if you've heard or are familiar with the Rendlesham Forest case. Put your hand up if you are. All right, put your hands down. Put your hands up if you're not familiar with the Rendlesham Forest case. So maybe not so many, but maybe a dozen or so. Well, my Rendlesham Forest is an incident that, in simple terms, occurred in late December 1980 in Suffolk, England. It happened in a forest called Rendlesham Forest that lay between 2 US Air Force bases called RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge. And the forest separated the twin bases by about 4 miles. And it became famous in a long, drawn-out kind of saga, but it is now referred to by many as the second most important UFO case in history, not just in the UK, but worldwide. Now, so this is how important this case is, and this is the book that I've been writing for the last 3 years and done a 5-year reinvestigation of the case using my detective skills, or former detective skills, to look at the evidence and think what is pertinent to have in the book and what is not pertinent to have in the book. So if in a sense, I took out all sentiment and really just decided to lay out the facts. Now, the Rendlesham Forest case is very unusual in the sense that it's not one event. When most UFO sightings take place, it's a one-off event. You see something, you have an experience, it's a one-off. Or in the case of the abduction phenomenon, often in childhood you will have your first encounter and then it becomes sporadic throughout your life. That's what many experienced stroke contactees, stroke abductees say. There isn't a great word to put on it. Some people, like you say, Tina doesn't like the word experiencer because it downplays the abduction side, i.e. being taken against your will. And that is, I still refer to it as the abduction experience because invariably when it begins there is no permission given. But in terms of the Rendlesham Forest cases, it actually includes elements of entities as well being seen. So if I was to start to take you through this case, I'm going to do it in 2 stages. So you're going to get a part 1 up till 1 o'clock, because Miles has said he'll give me an extra cup of tea if I finish at 1 o'clock for the first part, because he's let people run on. No need to say anything, Tina, but there you go. I'm only joking. But yeah, he wants me to get back on schedule, so I'll keep part 1 fairly quick. We'll stop at 1 o'clock, so you get your hour till 2, and then I'll be speaking last, and that's when we get into the real body of what my reinvestigation uncovered. I'd actually been following the case for a long time privately, because I did the same work. And basically what's happened is, allegedly, American servicemen from the twin bases were called out into the forest on a number of occasions in late December 1980. Let's just simplify it in that way. And there were a number of objects seen, and in that very first incident, there was an alleged landing of a triangular object, a physical object that was on the ground, 3 meters by 3 meters, so 9 feet by 9 feet, a bit more, 6 feet in height. It was black, it looked like glass, felt like glass to the touch. It was slightly warm, and it was emitting lights within. There was no obvious propulsion system, there were no windows or anything like that. So a strange object does appear to have landed, and it was referred to in a very famous document. So what this first part, up to lunch, is going to be is basically where we were prior to my reinvestigation, which began in 2017, 2018. All right? So it's like everything we knew up to that time. Now, the actual incident occurred in late December 1980. So this is a long time ago, and people are getting old now, inevitably, and people will start to die inevitably as well. So we need to capture the testimony as soon as we can. So we'll go through it now. The book is the result of a 5-year reinvestigation and 3 years in the writing, and very complicated to write because with it being multiple incidents, and we're not talking 2, I'll give you a clue that in the conclusion of my book, we're talking 17 different incidents. 17 different timed incidents over what we now think is 3/4 consecutive nights of activity. And not just in the forest, but on the twin bases as well, which is not what you're told. All right? There's been over 50 or 60 documentaries made to date, English speaking, and basically the narrative that you are presented with, I think, is now wrong. Not to say that people are lying, but the way the narrative is presented is fundamentally flawed, and we'll go into that, especially in the second half, in the last talk of the day today. So I'm doing this up till lunch, and then I think I've got the last hour and a half or something like that of today's proceedings. So we'll really get into the minutiae there. But what you've got to realise is that this is not just an event, a one-off event. It's a complex series of events over several days, many witnesses, many of whom are still to come forward. Many won't come forward, and I've talked to a number of them and had messages from people who have acted as intermediaries who said we won't come forward because of the way the case is presented, the current narrative presented by the TV. Yeah, they don't like it, and you'll see why that is as we go along. All right, so I go into this having studied the case for a long time because I guarded nuclear weapons, and essentially the people involved in this incident, American servicemen, they guarded nuclear weapons. So I kind of have a unique insight into what they did on protecting nuclear weapons. So that was my initial interest. I'd followed the subject, and then I went public with my research in December of 2007. So a long time ago now, and that's when I met a famous guy now responsible for arguably one of the most famous documents in UFO history called the Holt Memorandum, Colonel Charles Holt, retired, who was then the deputy base commander of the twin bases. And he wrote a very famous memo, which we'll talk about. But suffice to say is I got to know him for about 7 years. We collaborated on a potential film script that I was trying to write because I do believe that at some point Rendlesham will be made into a feature film, a major Hollywood feature film. The problem is, do you want Independence Day, i.e. special effects and fiction, or do you want to really tell the story of what happened to the airmen? I have talked with a number of producers over the years in relation to that script, and they basically want you to invent stuff to make it, give you a hero, a Harrison Ford kind of figure. And it's not, because it's happened over several shifts, numerous people, numerous days. There isn't any one central player that pulls it all together. Yeah? And I have walked away from potential film deals because they want to destroy it and put it something that's not. It'll either get made right or it'll get made wrong. I'd rather get it made right and wait for the opportunity. Yeah? If I'm involved at all. All right? So that's basically where I come into this. So my research has been going on publicly since December 2007. In 2017, I was asked to get involved in a film project, a documentary called Capel Green, a new documentary on Rendlesham. It was originally only supposed to be for the year, and it was really going to be about just one of the witnesses, but then quickly changed, and then it then was decided to expand it, and that's still in post-production. Hopefully it's going to be released in September of this year, but that'll be 6 years down the line. But that was in a sense that prompted my reinvestigation, because I realised that with the film taking so long to come out, something I never had envisaged and nobody else had envisaged, that I was sat on important interviews that I'd had with military witnesses who were directly linked. And some of those interviews took place in 2018, 2019, 2020. Now, if you imagine you're a police officer, a former police officer, and you're sat on potentially very striking evidence, should you be sat on it for year upon year upon year if you think that it should be out there in the public domain? So basically I decided that when my research was finished for the book, I would release it. There was no pre-publicity whatsoever, because there will be people in America who will not like the fact that I've put information out and analysed and stepped back and looked at it and reassessed through the eyes of a detective. There are some people who do not want this information that's in the book to come out. So there was no pre-publicity. I self-published. I could have gone to a publisher and probably got a big deal, but I didn't, because I knew that if I said on such and such a date the book's coming out, people in America, particularly some of the witnesses, and we'll talk about why, they would try to probably clamp it down. So I figured that if I self-publish, I'll get the truth out there, and once it's out there, the genie's out of the bottle. You can't put it back in. And that's so far working a treat. And no legal letters, etc., etc. So let's get going then. So this is the cover of the book. It's not a big sales ploy, but if ever I go to a conference, I usually do some kind of a deal. So as the editor of the UFO Truth magazine, this bi-monthly 96-page magazine, these are a couple of recent covers. That's the book cover that is available. Now, this is the first time this book has been available in a conference situation. So I obviously can sign it. It's doing very well on Amazon, but I want to actually take it further because it needs to be promoted to a wider level, because you can only do so much self-promotion on Amazon. You need a big publisher. But I've been waiting to get the necessary reviews back, not from the public, which are really, really good, but from the researchers that I've sent it to. So you've got to give them time to read it, etc., and evaluate it. And all of them are coming back really complimentary. So I will now probably look for a mainstream publisher with trying to promote it to a wider audience. Yeah? Okay, so that's the book cover. So there is that special deal. The book is $17.99. It's at the back. I've got a few more copies in the car if we sell out. $17.99, but instead of paying £33 for a 3-year subscription, you'd pay £22. So if you give me £40, then you get a 3-year subscription. You get this book signed, and also you'll get the first 50 issues of the magazine for free. That's worth £50. So basically for £100, you're only paying 40. So anyway, that's enough of me. Okay, so that's the book cover. It's 500 pages, and it's 5 years of reinvestigation and 3 years in the writing. let's do this in simple terms. And I realise that a lot of you may not be that familiar with the case, so I'm trying to simplify it. If we look at an aerial map here, you'll basically see that this area here within the red is essentially Rendlesham Forest. Doesn't look very big, but it's obviously from quite high altitude. You've got, this is the runway of what was, it's now a closed US Air Force base, RAF Woodbridge. And if we were to extend the map up there, about there would be another big runway, and that was the other twin base of RAF Pentwaters. But most of the events that we're going to be talking about occur within this kind of perimeter. Okay, and in particular, I'll highlight a few things. This is the edge of the base, and then you've got a perimeter fence where the forest is, and imagine a perimeter big high fence going along there. And then there's this little road going down to what is a public rural road. But this road is the military road that leads to what's called the back gate of RAF Woodbridge. Right, so it's the back gate. And this is very relevant for many of the sightings that take place. You'll hear people talk about the East Gate. Well, that's where we're talking about there. That's the perimeter fence. They come out the East Gate, down, and then this is the biggest part of what's called Rendlesham Forest. And then we'll talk at some point here about, you'll hear people talk about a farmer's field. This farmer's field is arguably the most famous farmer's field in the world, certainly in the UK. On some maps it's called Capel Green, on others it's the whole area is Capel Green. But on some old maps it's Capel Green, hence why the documentary that I'm involved in is called Capel Green. And in particular, what you should know is this little finger that sticks out. Area around there is an alleged second landing, which we'll talk about in the second talk this afternoon. Okay, so in simple terms, if ever you were to go to a murder scene, or I've been to a few train disasters and things like that, in some ways Rendlesham Forest is really kind of unique because it's actually all occurs, or a lot of it occurs, in a relatively short geographical area. It's a bit like a train set, a tabletop. It's walkable. You don't have to catch buses. You don't have to go to... You can literally walk around it in 3 or 4 hours. And for those of you that might be interested, I'm organising a tour, and there's only 4 places left, for Sunday the 20th of August. And I'm taking, based on the stuff that's in the book and what came out in the reinvestigation, I'm taking 2 groups of 25 out on the Saturday the 19th and Sunday the 20th of August, and there's 4 places left. But we can talk about that. Come and ask me about that. This story became, shall we say, world famous before the era of where we say things go viral. Well, in the days prior to the internet, the way you went viral was with usually a big sensational news headline. And the paper doesn't exist now, but there was a tabloid UK paper called The News of the World. And it was kind of often referred to as a scandal, you know, tabloid, you know, big sexy titles, and I had an affair with so-and-so and that kind of thing, politician. It was known for its kind of scandal headlines. But it had this huge headline on October the 2nd, 1983. And this is where the Rendlesham Forest case really became international. Prior to that, because bear in mind it occurred in 1980, December 1980, there are little bits of information had been floating out there. Some researchers, and we'll go into that shortly, had done some early research, and so things were known. But in terms of when it became international, when the world began to become aware that something major had occurred, it was this incident and the second. And the headline was quite startling. UFO lands in Suffolk and it's official. And they said it's official because it quoted from this document that I talked to earlier, what's called the Holt Memorandum, and we'll come on to that. But suffice to say that it was based on this memorandum that was written on US Air Force notepaper, a single page, 3 paragraphs, that had been sent by the US Air Force, passed through the squadron leader, Morland, who was the RAF liaison officer, who then passed it through to the Ministry of Defence, because the incident occurred, or they were saying that the incidents that were in the memorandum occurred in the forest, which was off the bases, and therefore on British land and not American land. If you're on the American bases, your technical class has been in America, yeah, because it's owned or leased from the Royal Air Force by the Americans. But technically, when they came out of the bases, so if they were on a public road driving a military vehicle, technically that's happened on British soil. And this, the incidents that were in the memorandum, and it related to, on 2 different nights, they said that happened in the forest, so therefore it was sent to the RAF and then to the Ministry of Defence, because it was a British problem, and they had to make a determination. We'll talk about that in a bit. So that's when it really goes global. Now, what we're talking about is a first night landing, what's universally recognised as the first night of what I think now is 4 consecutive nights, but the first night is not in doubt really anymore, that occurs on Christmas night into Boxing Day. So it's the night of Christmas night into Boxing Day morning. And basically there is a landed triangular craft found on the ground that kind of looked like that, 3 metres by 3 metres, 6 foot high, and that's some ground impressions that were found that were in a perfect equilateral triangle. Now, for the skeptics out there, they will try to say that this was made by rabbits. There's so much rubbish written, but unfortunately, as I will talk about, the British media have been very complicit in dumbing down this case. They don't want you, the public, to know the real events of what occurred. Okay? And this is one of the reasons why I decided to write the book, is to say, look, let's cut all the rubbish, let's cut all through the disinformation, and let's concentrate on the facts that have been established. Okay, so we know that there were 3 ground impressions, equilateral triangle made. The depressions are approximately 1.5 inches into the soil on each of them, and about 9-10 inches in diameter. Plaster casts were taken. If you look at that middle photograph, the plaster cast there is the reverse, if you see what I mean. So it's upside down. Yeah, so that's how the impression was into the ground. They were all to the same depth and the same size. So if we then go forward, I said to you early on that I'd got involved publicly in this case in December of 2007. And that's when the History Channel were making a documentary series which was called the first series of a series called UFO Hunters, with a researcher, an American researcher called Bill Burns. And they brought over a film crew, and they were going to talk to me about my police cases. And then I said to them, why else are you coming to the UK? And they said, oh, we're going to do Rendlesham. And I said, well, I'm interested in Rendlesham. They said, why? So I told them of my background of working with nuclear weapons, similar to what was involved in this case. And I said, I've got, a few questions. Who are you bringing over? And they said, oh, we're bringing over the former Deputy Base Commander, Charles Holt. I said, oh, I'd love to meet him. And they said, oh, you can ask him some questions. You can come down as well. So that's how I got involved publicly. So I'm in that 2007 episode about Rendlesham Forest, and I meet Colonel Holt. And interestingly, we got off to a really good start. He was a long-time military officer, retired. I had a 30-year policing career. There was some kind of mutual respect going on because we'd led disciplined kind of careers. And we got on really well. And at the end of meeting him over that first weekend, filming, I said, would you work with me? I think there's a film here and it needs to be written properly. Would you help me and collaborate on it? And he said, yeah, fair enough. So that's how our 7-year collaboration period began. And so I'd met him, so he is one of the most famous people that you'll see, and he's pretty much appeared in every English-speaking documentary that's ever been made, 50 or 60 so far around the world in English. That's the memorandum. It's only a one-page, and he sent it because he didn't really want to get involved. He didn't retire until 1991, so this is written 10 years before he retired. He thought, UFOs, this is going to kill my career. I really don't want to do this at all. And he was assured that the document would never come out. He was promised that he would never be released publicly. So anyway, he sent off the report, and it went up to the chain to the MOD and the government. The government, based on this, said, nah, there's nothing of defence significance. Nothing worthy of any further investigation, basically. But let's see why they made that kind of decision, because it doesn't really belie the facts that were in the document. Bear in mind, it's written US Air Force, yeah? So it's an official document, and it basically says, and the dates are wrong, we'll talk about that later, but the first paragraph basically outlines the first night landing, this triangular object that was seen on the ground. And then 2 nights later, Colonel Holt, who's then a lieutenant colonel, the deputy base commander, was then called out into the forest because UFOs had been seen again in the forest. Airmen were already out there in the forest, and he then went out and organised a team, and he went out in the forest. And he went out initially, and he makes no bones about it, to say that he wanted to debunk it. He thought it was rubbish, this. You know, he didn't really believe that there'd been a landed craft. But anyway, he went out there, but he then saw multiple UFOs himself. And the people that were with him saw them too. So he actually said in the third paragraph, I saw them too. And he signed it. Well, there aren't many deputy base commanders of a strike nuclear base that will go on the record. So it was very, very unusual. And that's why, in a sense, it's become so well known, because of his high rank. Okay, so that's that. And at the bottom there, how many, stick your hand up if you've heard of a former British MOD official called Nick Pope. Put your hand up if you have. All right, put your hand down. Who hasn't heard of Nick Pope? Congratulations. Okay, all right. We'll talk about Nick Pope because he does get a chapter in the book. And bear in mind, I'm only looking at the facts. Okay, and there is a curious story around Nick Pope. Okay, so there we go. Now, what a lot of people don't realise is that when we talked about that field in that aerial shot that we call Capel Green, this aerial farmer's field, that 2 particular prominent witnesses gave different marker indications. So when one guy, who was the original military whistleblower called Larry Warren, when he got involved, he said he entered the field via this double oak tree that's at the edge of the farmer's field. And yeah, the other ring, I can't see it because of the boarding, but the other ring shows the place where Colonel Holt, the deputy base commander, where he entered the field. So they have different marker trees, and they still exist. Although I'm told that a lot of the branches of this, what is, I think, a unique kind of marker tree, have been cut down recently. I'll be going back there soon for these walks that I'm doing based on the book, but that's not good if that's happening because they're destroying some of the valuable evidence. But this is the marker trees, and they'll become relevant further on. What a beautiful photograph. That's that farmer's field from an aerial footage. And there's a lot more to it, but I want to point out a few things to you. This is only working some of the times. There it is. Now, that's the back of it. The photograph's obscuring it, but there is a farmhouse just there. There's a little country road running along there, public road, at the back of the field, and there's a farmhouse there. That's a prominent thing. This has never been identified until I worked with Colonel Holt in 2010. That's my photograph of him pointing to this field and the location of where the beam came down at his feet, which we'll talk about in a bit. I.e., whilst he's out on the night, a UFO approaches at high speed, stops above the head about 1,000, 2,000 feet, and then shines akin to a laser beam down at his feet. So can you imagine a pencil beam coming down? And he's thinking, is this a threat? Is this communication? What is it? It lasted about 10 or 15 seconds, then it blinked off, the UFO shot away at speed. But that had never been identified until I took him around and we did a walk round. And so that's where that is. So a lot of people to this day have never seen that image. All right, and shown on this map like this. So all of you didn't know where that was. You knew that it happened in what's called the second farmer's field, but the second farmer's field is generally referred to as that one, but it was past the creek, which is there, which had a lot of water in at the time in 1980, not so much now, but that's where it happened, where he said, and he told me personally, and I've got it on video, where he says the beam came down. So that's interesting in itself. This field has become famous because of an alleged second landing. Hugely controversial because the person that made the claims initially was a guy called Larry Warren, who was this original military whistleblower. He was only 19, first posting, gets involved in something that he had no idea, walks into this, and he said that he went through, from his perspective, by this second oak tree, which is like a double oak, and he goes into the field, and there's basically what he sees is a mist on the ground, a strange circular pattern of mist, about 1 to 2 feet off the ground, that's he describes slightly as aspirin-shaped, and there are US Air Force security police all cordoned around it, maybe 10 or 15, basically in this circle around this circular patch. And then when he's out in the field and he's told to join this field, he's only in airman, he's the lowest of the low, rank-wise, and he's told to join this perimeter around this glowing, strange, glowing yellow, greenish mist. And then he hears someone shout, it's coming. And then he sees a red light come, this is the sea, by the way, the North Sea. It comes and you can see how close we are, about 5 miles distance, but from the sea, a red light, like the size of a beach ball, glowing red, flies in from the direction of the sea, and it stops above the yellow mist, which is in, if you imagine it within there, and then there's an explosion of light, and when everybody regains the right, because their eyes are dazzled, there is, where the yellow mist was, there was a translucent craft. So it morphed into something else. And you couldn't look at it direct because it kept shimmering, distorting, but you could kind of look at it through your peripheral. And it was much bigger. This was maybe 30 feet across. All right? And so that would be pretty weird. And then I want to point this out as well. Now, Colonel Holt said that he was taken to the original first night landing site. You remember when there was black triangle on the ground on the first night? Well, he said that's happened about there. And we know that because the double tree is around here. And he said it was 45 degrees behind me, perhaps 75 meters. Okay, so it's somewhere in that area. Now, what you've got to realize is that's a modern photograph. In 1987, 90% of all the forest was destroyed. For those of you who are youngish like me will remember this, there was a very famous clip saying there's a report of a hurricane going to happen, and the weatherman goes, no, the people are talking about a hurricane. And then the next day, akin to a hurricane happened for the UK, and we lost basically 90% of the trees in this area. So it pretty wasn't like a hurricane. And so this is the trees that have regrown up, and they're not the same trees. I'll show you images of the real trees, and you can see why they are relevant. If you look on this map, these will be original trees. I'll go back. These ones here will be an original tree. They're a lot higher than all the others. But what you notice is that their stems, see that first 15, 20 feet has no branches, basically. Yeah? So it has a canopy on the top, and it plays an important part, because people say that objects were seen under the canopy of trees. So imagine that you would be able to see something that was between these very neatly spaced out trees in rows. A bit like if you think of a military grave, and you've got graves and headstones all neatly laid out in lines. Well, the trees were very much in the same kind of pattern, and they had nothing for the first 15, 20 feet. It's really relevant, and they're not the same trees now. So when you go there, it's not the same, although you can still see the odd example of the real trees. But it's really relevant because they see UFOs manoeuvring through and underneath the canopy of the trees. Yeah? Which is entirely possible if you look at those two. Small objects, we're not talking big objects, maybe 3-4 feet balls, glowing red balls, manoeuvring through the trees, clearly under intelligence. A lot of them were seen to be like dripping molten metal. Sounds crazy. None was ever found, but material was seen to drop off them that was never found on the ground. Okay, so that's a really, really good aerial view of some of the key areas that we'll come back to. Now, I talked about nuclear weapons, and there's been a huge debate over the years whether there really was any nuclear weapons stored at one of the bases, which is called RAF Bentwaters, underground. Now, the first night I met Colonel Holt, the very first night, we chatted, we got on really well, and he told me something that he really shouldn't have told me. But he said there were more nuclear weapons underground at RAF Bentwaters than anywhere else in Europe. Now, bear in mind, these twin bases were the UK's top strike base. It was there, it's Cold War. It's not as it is now. So it's Cold War, 1980. And had the Soviet Union wanted to come through from the likes of Finland and move down through with the tanks, Denmark, etc., that twin base complex was first responding with tactical nuclear weapons. Yeah? If they needed to be used. So it was the top strike base in Britain, so very interesting. So he tells me that, and then later denies it. And still does. But he told me that. Well, if you were an officer, I fully understand this, and if he's asked, they'll say, well, were the nuclear weapons there? And he'll go, well, I can neither confirm or deny. That's the typical cop-out that the military will give. And he don't really answer yay or nay. But he then, privately, after he's retired, many years after he's retired, he gave a presentation about nuclear weapons and the correlation between nuclear weapons and UFOs at a conference in Washington, D.C., at the National Press Club, where I'd got my award from, same place, and he gave this personal affidavit. And he said, in keeping with the official Air Force policy, blah, 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 there are some people who say that it's nuclear weapons. Yeah? So it was him getting round his dogma of the rules and regulations. But I found a document in the book that said that it held 25 nuclear weapons. But the way he talked is there were literally hundreds that shouldn't have been there. Well, if you had acquired an arsenal that went against the nuclear armament agreements, are the governments going to make that openly? If they're asked about it, they're going to deny it. Of course they are, and then you'll never know. But that's what he told me. And he told me that on 2 occasions. The second time, he told me with my then wife. And so he repeated it. So there were, and in the course of my reinvestigation, I talked to 6 military witnesses who were directly involved in the events, and they said, yeah, we were guarding tactical nuclear weapons. Now, when people talk about entities, you've got to be careful, because there is so much rubbish out there on the internet, like I said right at the start. But in the Rendlesham Forest case, there are 2 reports, 2 credible reports, corroborated on each occasion by 2 people. The first occasion is Larry Warren with Adrian Bustinza, and we'll talk about that later. And then the second time is Adrian Bustinza and John Burroughs. Okay, we'll talk about that later. Okay, but the first person who actually mentioned him, any of those people. Anybody know what this guy's name is? Come on, Colin. Come on, Ben. Come on. Call yourself Rendlesham Researchers. Come on, who's this guy? This guy would have been the original military whistleblower and not Larry Warren. Within 3 or 4 days of the incidents taking place in the forest, this guy was contacting Brenda Butler, who was one of the early civilian investigators of the case, along with another person called Dot Street. And they began to hear things because they knew people on the bases, and they would often go on the bases for dances and things like that. They'd got friendships. Well, Brenda Butler was friendly with this guy. He'd known her about 5 years, and he knew of her interest in UFOs. And this guy is called J.D. Ingalls. And he would have been the original military whistleblower. But this guy did it as a pseudonym. And he would not go on the record. So when you see that first headline, they talk about this first whistleblower, it's this kind. And there's a drawing attributed to him, and he talks about 3 entities being seen against a landed craft and then being hovering in the... That's down to this guy. But he wouldn't go public. And we now think that and later on, about 7 years afterwards, he went to see Brenda and said that it was all disinformation. But we think by then, he'd been put up to say that, to try to downplay it. But yes, so he would have been, J.D. Ingalls, that's his real name, he would have been the first guy. But he didn't go public, so therefore he couldn't be. Because a whistleblower is somebody that puts their name to it. Yeah? So, who was the original military whistleblower? And that's this guy we talked about, Larry Warren. A lot of you will be familiar with the case. He wrote a book called Left at East Gate, still a good book, written with his co-author, Peter Robbins. But he was only 19, he gets caught up in this. But he's an airman. He's the lowest of the low, rank-wise. And he's the one that said that he joined the field, the red light stopped over the glowing mist, there was an explosion of light, and then there's a craft there. Well, for a long, long time, and especially in the last 6 or 7 years, there's been an ongoing debate where a group in the UK, so-called researchers, but they're not, they're just trolls. And I say a troll because if you disagree with them, they then start calling you effing and this and that, and that's a troll. If you've got an opinion that's different to mine, that's fine, and we have a reasoned discussion about it. But if you end up starting calling people and then start to ring up radio shows and start to call them this, that, and the other, and there's no evidence, that's wrong. And that's just a downside to the internet. But anyway, he was a controversial figure. But for the first 8 years, between 1983 and 1991, until Lieutenant Colonel Holt retired in 1991, he was the only person who would go on camera and say, I was there, I witnessed this, using his real name. So we owe him a lot. We would not have really, the case would not have advanced probably without him, and there's lots of people, and facts are pointed out in the book that by quotes from people who confirm that. Right, but so we owe it to him. Reinvestigation begins in 2017, when I get asked to do that. It's 5 to 1. Ooh. The reinvestigation that we'll talk about in the last hour and a half is where I start to reveal the stuff that came out. There are things that I'm going to... In fact, we'll go back there because I'm going to stop it early, Miles, so we do finish on one. I'm going to finish on this slide. All right, because I want you to save all the good stuff for the next bit. All right, this is the setup. These two guys here are called Ray Boucher, Scott Colburn. They lived in Nebraska, and their senator was a guy called Senator James Exxon. And he plays a part, and we'll go on to that in the next few slides after when I come back later this afternoon. But they were part of a huge, the largest UFO group in the world called MUFON, Mutual UFO Network. It's based in America, but it has representatives kind of all over the world. But it's mainly America, to be fair. But they were very good, proper, diligent researchers. And I thought I knew the case really well. But when I got involved in the documentary, I thought, well, if I'm going to put my name to it as the lead researcher, it better be accurate. So it gave me the kick up the arse to say, right, let's go make sure. And when I actually went back, I went through every document I could find, little old publications that nobody had ever heard of, UFO, little booklets and things like that. And I came across a lot of new interviews that I'd not been aware, new as in the sense of old, but I was unaware of. But they contained pertinent witness information that I think hasn't been reported, and you should be able to read about it. So anyway, these two people play a really important part. And this guy in particular, Ray Boucher, plays a really important part, because when we talk about was there this second landing in a farmer's field, he was able to produce, and he had a conversation in 1985, 6 years before Colonel Holt, who you see in all the documentaries now, TV personality, before he retired. So he was not the TV personality as he is now. So he captured him while he was still in the job, 6 years before he retired, and he rings him on the phone. And the reason why he rings him is because they lived in Nebraska, and they were so impressed with the case from afar that they told their senator about it. He says, because this is involving American servicemen. Surely it's of interest to the American government, and surely the Senate should be delving into this case. It's such a good case. And he wasn't interested at first, but they eventually got him to the stage where he became interested. And one of the things that got him finally interested was when Ray Boucher rings Colonel Holt out of the blue in April 1985, still in the job, never really spoken to the press before. And he said, "My name's Ray Boucher. I'm a UFO researcher working for MUFON. I'm interested in Rendlesham Forest case. I've spoken about the Rendlesham Forest incident with a number of military witnesses who were there, including Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, including Airman Larry Warren." They're saying basically that there was a second landing, that there was a craft on the ground, that it was surrounded by security, US Air Force security police officers, and that it was being filmed on cameras, two different types of cameras, as in motion picture, not still photographs, moving image, moving footage. It was being filmed. And that the base commander, a guy called Colonel Williams, who went on to become a two-star general, was also present at that scene. All right? And he said, and that's where we'll conclude for the first part, Miles. Thank you.
Okay, Gary Heseltine, thank you very much. You're closing the show. Make it a good one. Good.
Right, okay, we left on part one, where we're just about to go into the deep... No laughing now. When we went... I left you on like a bit of a precipice. You were all excited, or maybe it was just the thought of lunch. But really, I did leave you. Watch your legs, said the organiser. Any more coming in? Just take your time. I don't mind waiting. I should have been a stand-up comedian, really, shouldn't I? Hecklers. Okay, right, let's go then. I left you on the edge of a precipice. It's going to be fast, lots of information. All right, so I set it up that this guy, Ray Boucher, MUFON researcher, he researched Rendlesham for 3 years. He and his colleague Scott Colburn, the other guy in the photograph, did excellent work. Arguably the best work ever done in early research, in my opinion. Just my opinion. But one of the things that this guy did is he rang up Charles Holt. And he'd already spoken to Larry Warren, the original military whistleblower, and he'd already interviewed Sergeant Adrian Bustinza in a very early account. And so he kind of knew some of the story, and he laid it all out, trying to get more information from Colonel Holt about what went on. So he laid out this scenario that basically there'd been a second landing, or a landing, that it was surrounded by security police. He was getting this information for Senator James Exon, the senator for Nebraska, where they lived. The case involved American servicemen, so they'd gone to him and saying, look, you should be interested in this. This is American servicemen. He said, get me more evidence. So he rang Holt out of the blue. This is 6 years before Holt retired in 1991. And he lays it out and he says, basically, and I'll just paraphrase to what I said where we left before lunch, was there's a landed craft in a field. It's surrounded by security police officers. It's been filmed on motion picture cameras. This is not still photographs, movie video for want of a better word, movie. And that Colonel Williams, the base commander of 12,000 personnel, was there in that scenario. And this was his response. That scenario. And this was his response. He told him, yes, I can verify. He told him that I can substantiate all of that for the senator. So that scenario that he put to him about this other landing, and that it was being filmed and that the base commander was there, he totally submitted to that. Now, this was an incredible admission when I found it. Now, when I spoke to Ray Boucher, I had a Skype with him originally in 2018, I said, I don't suppose you've got your research notes. And he says, yeah, I'll have them somewhere. And I've been told that before, so I kind of took that with a pinch of salt. But anyway, I said, if you can find them, would you put them together and send me them so I can go through them? And he said, yeah, okay. And again, like I thought, well, it probably won't happen. But about 2-3 weeks later, I get a PDF of all his research, 345 pages of scanned material. And I went, wow. And this is like gold dust, because this is early research into this very famous case. And when I came across this, this was amazing, because what he'd done is, when he wrote it, he'd phoned him up, and then he wrote it down. His response was written down verbatim. So that comment was written down verbatim, kind of like starred. Okay? Now, why that's interesting is because Colonel Holt has since denied ever saying that to Ray Boucher. And after he retired, has said vehemently that Colonel Williams wasn't there. This second landing of a UFO was ridiculous. Talk of aliens, and that it was being on film, and that the base commander was there. Oh, that's just pure fiction. But there he was 6 years before he became this TV personality, admitting in a verbatim written down. Now, some people have said, you know, maybe it was just taken out of context, and so it's not really that definitive admission. Well, as a former police detective, I was drawn to the fact that it was written down verbatim. Why would Ray Boucher make this up? Why is he going to put it out there, which he did subsequently and repeated this within UFO journals, etc., in America? Why would he do that? And you won't be able to read this, but this paragraph is really interesting, because he relates exactly what he said. And it says that verbatim he recorded that comment. So there was no ambiguity about this. Colonel Holt was admitting 6 years before he retired from the Air Force that Colonel Williams was there, the base commander of 12,000 personnel, that a second landing, which he didn't know at the time was a second landing, but another landing, not this small triangular object that was seen on the first night, it was there. And this is an admission written down verbatim. No ambiguity whatsoever. And this is not one. There are several letters that Ray Boucher sent to Senator James Exxon, where he relays all the facts, and Holt told me this on such and such a date, and I wrote it down verbatim. Now, it's an interesting thing is, he found out later that Senator James Exxon, who had got interested in the case, suddenly wouldn't reply to anything, wouldn't speak to him on the phone, and he thought, I wonder why. He then found out through one of his aides, the senator's aides, that there'd been a meeting between Colonel Holt and Senator James Exxon, and after that, Exxon would not speak ever again to Scott Colburn and Ray Boucher. So this earlier information takes on even more significance. So in my opinion, as a former detective, this was a bona fide admission 6 years before Holt retired, that he's since distanced himself, denied ever since, and says, oh, I didn't say anything to Ray Boucher about that. It's a lie, in my opinion. There is absolutely no reason why Ray Boucher would make up something and then put it out publicly. He was a very diligent researcher. He's now a clergyman, still a clergyman, a reverend in the United States, but he's a very honest, genuine guy. And I have no reason to doubt that he recorded a verbatim admission by Colonel Holt as to the importance of this. We'll come back as to why that's important. So that's one incident where Colonel Holt, who has since become this very famous public figure that you see virtually in every documentary, okay? But it wasn't the only historical thing that I found out in the deep dive of old historical material. He tried to sell his story to the News of the World. Before, he was in negotiations with Keith Beebe. Keith Beebe was the News of the World reporter who was responsible for that big headline in October of 1983 that splashed it across the world. UFO lands in Suffolk, and it's official. 4 independent sources verified that Holt had been trying to sell his story while he was still in the Air Force. He'd been in negotiation. Now, Jenny Randalls, if anybody's heard of Jenny Randalls, she was a very famous person in UK ufology in the 80s and 90s, wrote lots of books. She was the head of BUFORA, British UFO Research Association, at one time. She's quite elderly now, so you don't really see her much, but she did play a prominent role. Well, early on in the 80s, she became very involved in the Rendlesham research because 2 housewives who were familiar with the base, knew some people who worked on there, called Brenda, Butler and Dot Street. They were the first civilian researchers, and they began to hear stories of something happening in the woods within days of the incident. She later teamed up with them and wrote a book called Sky Crash. Now, really, Jenny Randalls was really the author of Sky Crash, because she was more of a writer, and the other 2 contributed, but Jenny Randalls was really the author. Now, she was one of the people that Keith Beebe, this News of the World reporter, actually showed her a list of things that Colonel Holt was prepared to give to the newspaper as part of his selling his story. There were apparently about 10 things on the list. She only kind of remembered one of them, and not accurately, or she can't be certain whether it was accurate. But what Keith Beebe said, you can't take any photographs, but you can look at this folder. And he opened up the folder, and there was this list of 10 things that Holt was apparently prepared to sell. This is 1983, before the big headline in October. And still while he was serving, 8 years before he retired. So what was that about? Now, the only stipulation was that Holt had said is, I can't go public with this story until I retire. So what he was effectively doing was, this is going to be a big story in the future, and when I retire in 1991, we'll do a big splash and I'll sell my story for X amount of money. Don't know how much. However, when the Holt Memorandum came out, that came out unexpectedly. It was never supposed to be released to the public, but it came out indirectly because of Larry Warren, who had gone public in the United States and had told people, and there was an organisation called CAUSE, and basically they'd submitted loads of freedom of information requests, and the Air Force steadfastly said for almost 3 years, no, there's nothing to it at all. We've no documentation whatsoever. But eventually they went back, and Larry Warren had put himself out as a named person who was a direct witness. And so they went back and said, well, we've actually got a named witness. And this time, this document surfaced. That was unexpected. It was never supposed to be released. And of course, it's signed by Deputy Commander, Base Commander Colonel Holt. So this became very famous. And this is what prompted the News of the World to jump the gun on Holt's agreement with the News of the World, because they said, wow, we've got this incredible document written by you that's saying there's 2 incidents. It's written on Air Force paper. We've got to run with it, or some other newspaper will get hold of it and run the story. So they said, we're running it. So that's the only reason it jumped the gun. But Holt was prepared to sell his story 8 years before he retired. Right? You never hear Holt mentioning this now. 4 sources, and the best one was from an astronomer who was regarded as a skeptic, and his name is Ian Ridpath. For those people who will be familiar with the Rendlesham case, when we talked about the lighthouse theory, astronomer, Ian Ridpath, was basically the person who invented that story. And then, if you remember those people who are familiar, he did this famous video sequence where at night he basically says, look, when you marry up the blinking of the lighthouse, which was every 5 seconds, to the audio tape that Colonel Holt took, which we'll talk about in a bit, it matches it exactly. Well, if you'd have done that for 20 seconds, it would have worked. But if you'd done it for a minute, it wouldn't have matched at all. But clever editing and the way that the TV and newspapers reported it made it look like there was a correlation. So what the men had seen, well, they were just, you know, they got excited by something mysterious going on in the woods, and they confabulated it into seeing the beams of a lighthouse. Absolute rubbish, and it always was. But unfortunately, because I believe that the authorities, both the UK and UK government, the US government, and also the military, the Ministry of Defence, the US Defence Department, they wanted to play this case down because it was such a good case. And they, I'm sure, I can't prove it, but they, I'm sure, went to the British media at the highest levels, whether it's a D notice or whatever, I can't prove it, but they then basically said, we've got to keep this case down. So then immediately the big headline comes out in the news of the world, just on the, literally the next day, the Times newspaper, so the Times people would say is our top newspaper. And they then did this really ridiculous, childish piece dismissing the Holt Memorandum, which was an official document that revealed 2 different UFO events. So this was not just people making this up or lights in the sky. This was 2 events signed by the Deputy Base Commander. So the very next day, the Times newspaper, our top publication, were absolutely dismissing it in childish terms. Does that sound like great, eminent reporting by the Times? No, it doesn't. So there had to be a reason for that. And that's because this had come out, which was really good, and then you had to bring out a piece that trivialised it, made it sound crazy. And who better? The most respected newspaper in the UK. So you can see how they straight away got the doubt in. And then within days, Ian Ridpath, the astronomer, is coming out, and he's doing this piece that gets tremendous coverage. If we talk about going viral, that's the equivalent. And this clip of the 5 seconds, and it still gets churned out in documentaries now. It was absolute bullshit. Forgive my French. But it was right from the off. Colonel Holt said right from the off, lighthouses don't fly. They don't send beams down at your feet, etc., etc. It was always ludicrous. But the lighthouse theory was put forward by Ian Ridpath, backed up by a forester called Vince Thurkettle, and they became the sceptical side to put down the significance of this case. Nobody promoted the evidential side, the good stuff. The press then went into overdrive. We've got to destroy this case. We've got to put doubt in the minds of the public. And that's exactly what they did, and very effectively, as we still know, because every documentary still talks about a lighthouse. But Ian Ridpath, who would be referred to as a skeptic in this subject, he was one of the 4 people who corroborated that Holt had tried to sell his story in 1983, because he said he wrote a letter to an American UFO publication, and I've got the letter, and he says, I can confirm that in December of 1983, so 2 months after that big headline story, that Keith Beebe, the reporter who'd written that headline story, and who'd been in negotiation with him, he actually said, Keith Beebe, I attended a lecture with Keith Beebe, and he told the audience that Colonel Holt had been trying to tell the story in early 83. Now, this is coming from somebody who's no UFO bias. He's not pro-UFO at all. But when I found that one, I thought, well, that's actually the best of the 4, because this is from a skeptic, confirming, no reason to say it, but confirming that Beebe had admitted personally to a lecture of how many people were there that Holt had tried to sell his story. Now, this is highly significant when you see the comments made by Holt now. All these years later, now he's the TV personality. We'll come on to that. So let's go back on. Okay, so that's that. Now, there was another historical event, and you can still get to see this, and it's arguably still the best UFO documentary on Rendlesham so far, because it's early, and it's near to the event. And this was released in 1985. It was cable news network CNN, and they basically put out a 3-part special all on Rendlesham. And most of the witnesses appeared blacked out, and they just put Sergeant B or Officer C. Yeah, and people were talking in dark shadow, as it were. The only one that didn't was Larry Warren, the regional military whistleblower, who said, "I'm Larry Warren and I saw this." Okay? Now, they're the two ladies who were well, in fact, that on the left is Jenny Randalls, the lady who was with Bufora, wrote lots of books, now would be regarded arguably as a true skeptic on the subject, but she wasn't then. In the middle is Dot Street, who was one of the 2 original housewives who were doing the research, and that's Ray Boucher, obviously a lot taller. Makes it look like he's a giant, but he's not. They're just very small. The narrative that was pre-2017, when I did the research, was that basically these 3 people, all witnesses, all genuine witnesses, Colonel Holt, Sergeant Jim Penniston, Airman John Burroughs. Now, all of those had been involved in the 2 incidents that had been released and were quoted in the Holt Memorandum, that document that had been released that should never have come out, which basically highlighted 2 incidents. The first night involving Jim Penniston and John Burroughs, the landed triangular craft, and then 2 nights later, Holt leads a team out into the forest and he says, "I saw multiple UFOs," and he signed the document. But basically, after all the research that I've done, this is going to come back that has a big impact on me. The more I do the research, the more stuff I find. The original military whistleblower is this guy. And his count was basically of this incident in the field. Well, it didn't match their story or his story. But he was out there from 1983 to 1991 on his own. My name is, and I saw that. Strange thing happens. 1991, he retires. 1993, he retires. 1995, from the full-time, I think he retired. As soon as those 3 come out, they immediately start attacking this guy and say, "No, it doesn't match our recollections of the event." Holt, in particular, is scathing about this guy. It's like he's got a real downer on it. He's a wannabe, he made it all up, he was busted out the Air Force, none of which is true. But because of his rank, he was allowed to get away with it. And how many people actually call a colonel a liar? Or even raise a question that you might be lying? And the answer is none. TV treats these people like, "Oh, they can't ask those kind of questions." Well, just as an aside from that, that's crap as well, because if you think about it, didn't President Richard Nixon get impeached, get kicked out? So if we can do it to a president, why can't we ask questions of a colonel? If you think to Iran-Contra, running weapons, that colonel got busted, as it were. So people in authority can lie, and often do. But we don't like asking those questions. Now, just as an aside, before we really start going down deeper into what's come out, is I found this a great quote. This is an early research, but nobody really refers to it. And I didn't know Bob Osler at that time. He's since passed away. But before he died, I actually contacted him and said, "Look, I came across this reference." And of course, this was in, I can't see this, 2018. I contacted him. This was maybe a year before he died. And I said, "You know, can you confirm that what is that quote from it that was in a book, is that accurate?" He said, "Yeah, it's absolutely accurate." And what he'd said was that Colonel Holt had admitted to him in 1993 that the National Security Agency, the NSA, the most secretive of all the intelligence agencies, had an interest in Larry Warren. Well, why, if he wasn't involved, if he was a wannabe, if he was not a part of it at all, why would they have any interest? Holt had tried, as his rank at colonel, to get hold of his military record, couldn't get it, blocked off. Why? Holt had confirmed that beams from a UFO had penetrated the nuclear weapons bunkers at RAF Bentwaters. We'll come on to that because another witness has surfaced to our interview. Okay, so again, he endorses a book quote to me that says, genuine, that's absolutely as it is. Now, Holt has since denied any of these things. So you see that these early admissions, either just before he retired and just after, before he became this public personality that you see in all the 50, 60 documentaries, was a far different Colonel Holt. So, let's look at a final thing. Prior to my research, was there any evidence to say that Larry Warren's account of this landing in a field was real? It wasn't just made up. And the answer is yes, because another guy, Sergeant Adrian Bustinzi, in 1984 had admitted to Ray Boucher that he was in the field and saw it too. But funnily enough, nobody refers to that. None of the documentaries refer to that. Why not? It's like this man's account don't count for anything. And yet there he was being mentioned early on. So at that time, Adrian Bustinza, this guy, had said, yeah, he was in the field with me and there was a landing of another craft. And another airman, who again was interviewed in 1984, long interview that's transcribed in the book, with an American detective called Larry Fawcett, who wrote a book about UFOs called Clear Intent, a good early book on UFOs, about the best evidence, military documents, that kind of thing. They did one chapter on the Rendlesham case, which was then called the Bentwaters case. And Airman Greg Batram's interview with Ray Boucher earlier, and then with Larry Fawcett, it was clear from Batram's comments that he said, as I was running away from my own UFO encounter, and he was running away with 3 others because they were scared, they were running from the incident where they'd seen a UFO, which he described as being like a mist on the ground and then a craft, and he said there was some kind of intelligence. And he ran out of the forest literally scared with his colleagues, and they ran to what's called the staging area. This is an area that we'll talk about in a little bit, which is where all the vehicles could go no further. So when they went into the forest road that led in the forest basically stopped at a dead end. You couldn't go any further, you had to go on foot. So that became like a meeting area where all the vehicles are ditched and people go off into the forest for various reasons. So that's a collection point of vehicles and people, and that's now known as the staging area. Now, he said that as I'm running out of the forest to the staging area, I see new military vehicles turning up, and I see Larry Warren, this guy, this is Greg Batram, he says, I see Larry Warren just arriving as I'm running away from something. So that's another person's account that nobody gets talked about, but it's relevant. It's an early 1984 historical interview that's closest to the actual time of the event. Obviously, over time, people's memories will fade. That's the nature of the mind and the way memories will fail. But if something is really impressed, it's a special kind of memory. It's not script memory. This is something that's burned into your soul. It's a really pertinent memory. You tend to remember those. You can lose bits around it, the exact date, but the actual detail of what you saw, if you've ever had a UFO encounter, you'll remember it like it was yesterday, but you might not remember the date, exactly the time, or whatever. But the essential story will be fixed because it's ingrained into your memory, because it's so powerful. It affects your psyche. So here we are, early interviews that have literally been totally forgotten about by virtually all of the Rendlesham people, researchers. They get hardly any real mention. When Ray Boucher and Scott Colbain's work is referred to, it's an anecdote. And you do get mention where they'll say, yeah, they did some research and Holt apparently said this and he said that. but there's no context around it. So it's like a little footnote. Nobody really puts it into the real context. So that's what I did in the book. I give it the real context and all the letters that were sent and the fact that it was written down verbatim and the fact that there was no ambiguity. This was an admission. So a lot of stuff that you are not being shown should have been shown to you. And the only person that's talking about this stuff is me in the entire world. And there was no pre-publicity for the book deliberately, because if I'd have said that this book is coming out on such and such a date, I have no doubt that some of these American witnesses would have tried to stop me through legal means. So there was no pre-publicity. I slipped it out as soon as it was ready because I wanted to get the truth out there. You're never going to get anybody criticising Holt, Pennison and Burroughs or Nick Pope. Why? Aren't they allowed to be questioned like anybody else about the veracity of some of their material? They should be, but they're not, because the narrative that I think of the case is being controlled. And this is what I'm trying to change with this book. And that's because I've started to talk to other witnesses who've come forward, like this guy, Steve Longero. I've talked to Steve LaPlume, who plays a tiny role, but in a little important role. But that guy there, that's my own conference that I had in 2018, and this was a new witness. Now, the significance of this guy is really interesting. So, reinvestigation was the new information that starts to appear. Direct witness testimony from Steve Longero and Adrian Bustinza. Adrian Bustinza was the one that I've mentioned, who'd said in 1984 that Larry Owen was there. But this person was very emotionally affected by what he saw. He was religious. He found it very difficult to deal with because it went against his faith. His family had been surveilled. He was given a very hard time. We'll talk about this. But he was a very, very reluctant witness. I tried to get to him several times, wouldn't even respond. But eventually he did. And I ended up having a 4.5-hour transatlantic phone call that cost me 180 quid, but it was the best money I've ever spent. I wasn't thinking that at the time, but it went through the night. He'd just come in from work, and I said, I'm going to try, I was an advanced interview, and I said, I'm going to try a technique on you called the enhanced cognitive model, which is not hypnosis or anything. You can't hypnotize somebody from 2,000 miles away. But I said, I'm going to try to adapt it, and I said, I really just want to prepare you to concentrate. And so I talked him through, and eventually I said, I'm going to hand over the interview to you. I'm not going to interrupt you. I want you to just say whatever you want to say. And he spoke for 4.5 hours. And I did not interrupt him for the first 2 hours. Now, that's not normal, because our natural, as an interviewer, it's I speak, you speak, I speak, you speak. That's called a conversation. When you do an advanced interview and you want this first account, what's called a first account, you don't want to interrupt their train of thought. So if you're really trying to prep somebody and said, look, I want you to really concentrate, look at the ceiling, look down at your feet, look at the wall, whatever you want to do, what's comfortable for you, but I want you to try to concentrate and remember. And he did. And he didn't expect it to work, but it did. And he spoke literally for the first 2 hours non-stop. And that's not easy if you're listening, because our natural inclination is to come in and say, I speak, you speak, and you start breaking up the train of thought. So it's called Googling. Googling. You go, okay, all right, okay. And I'm not interrupting him. And he's still in that mindset, and he's recalling stuff. And it's called retrieving fresh snow, because they're really concentrating. And sometimes something will pop into their head that they didn't remember. And then suddenly it comes back, and that's called fresh snow. And that's what you're trying to get. But anyway, suffice to say that happened, and it worked really well. And in the book, I also have a 75-minute Skype interview with him on video as well. And we talk about other things as well that's related to the case. But it was spellbinding. And hearing his testimony, when I transcribed his interview, which took 10 days, because 4.5 hours of audio, it was audio recorded, 4.5 hours of audio to transcribe was over 100 and odd pages of foolscap. Yeah? And of course you've got to stop and you think, did I hear that right? Play it again. So I write it down full scat and then typed it all up. But when I actually played it back, and we'll talk about some of the content later on, because he's interrogated after the event, and he's threatened with his life, it's palpable the fear that he had when he was being interrogated, but that's something for later. So, okay, so Steve Longero emerges. And Steve Longero is an interesting character. Now, these are all the Capel Green confirmations, and that's for the documentary, and I supplied this for the documentary. These are all the bits of information that matches the incident in the field. There's a lot of confirmations there, isn't there? Yeah. So not just Larry Warren talking about it, not just Adrian Bustinza talking about it, that involved elements. It was filmed. The base commander was there. Aliens, entities were seen. All of those are there's about 18 there, as I seem to think, and I mentioned 15 in the book. Multiples. Larry Warren, at the beginning of the reinvestigation, I wasn't responsible for this, but that's me in the background, sat down. I was invited by the director of this forthcoming documentary called Capel Green to, did I want to come to London? Because there was going to be a polygraph test with Larry Warren. Okay? Now, a modern polygraph test involves 5 pieces of equipment that is all hooked up to your body, your hands, and it's every response that these 5 different things are registered on a laptop, and you basically are asked a series of questions, control questions, and then you're asked again, and then you're asked again in different ways. And this lady is the top UK researcher. She's an Anglophile American, lives here, married to an English guy, works from home in London, done over 2,000 polygraph tests. She's, I think, the chairman of the Great Britain Society of Polygraph Tests. That's how good she is. And she decided that she was going to do it because she was interested. She'd never done anything like this, never worked on the UFO field. And she agreed to do it, didn't charge a fee. And anyway, I was invited down as part of the documentary process, and they had 5 different remote cameras. And we weren't allowed to see the actual test, but the preparation, I helped her with the preparation and what questions to ask and the scenario, what allegedly this man was saying. Now, imagine somebody says to you, just, I don't care how good a driver you are, but if I said to you, you're doing your driving test tomorrow, and you took it 30 years ago, would you be driving at the same level you were 30 years ago? Because you developed bad habits. Okay, so would you be in slight apprehension about sitting your driving test? Would you pass it tomorrow? Would you be thinking, oh shit, am I going to pass? I've got all these bad habits. Well, imagine the original military whistleblower agreeing, he's the only person ever to do this in the Rendlesham Forest case. No other person has done a polygraph. He agreed to do this with the top examiner, put his life on the line and his whole credibility. It's 94% accurate. All right? So he's agreed to do that. You cannot get any more fearful. I'm stepping into the lion's den. And I watched him, and I watched him before it happened, and I'm thinking, are you all right? And he went, yeah, fine. And I'm thinking, Jesus, you're very calm. Because I believed him, but there's one thing, putting yourself into the lion's den. And he was doing that, and that took a lot of guts, because nobody else has done it. And the suffice to say is, he passed it with flying colours. So was he in the forest? Yes. Did he see beings? Was it surrounded by security police officers? Yes. Passed with what she said was very good charts. And in the documentary, you'll see this live remote cameras of that test. And I've seen that footage. And when you see it, you will, some of you, I think, will be in tears, like I had tears in my eyes. Because the response to being told that you passed with flying colours is I'm not going to give it away, but it's very emotive. And she said a very interesting thing afterwards. She says, people get emotional if they're telling the truth, if they have really done it. And to be told that, he got really emotional. because you can imagine that relief, and you've carried all this, and people have been calling you all the names under the sun. And we'll go on to that. But that was important. This lady here, Lieutenant Bonnie Templin, we're going to come on to her new revelation story. We knew that something happened to her, but we didn't know what exactly. We knew that she was so traumatized that she had to go off shift, but we didn't really know why. We didn't have any first-hand witness testimony. Now we do. We have a partial first-hand witness account from a guy called Michael Stacey Smith. We'll go on to that. But this is what came out in the book. There were normally 4 shifts, but essentially all the activity happens on either what we would call a late turn, or as they used to say, give my age away, a 2 to 10 or something like that, an afternoon shift. And then we'd have a night shift. Well, believe it or not, the Americans call their night shift the mid shift. Now, if that was me, I'd think it's the afternoon shift, but it's not. It means their midnight shift. So forget that, but essentially you had basically, for a nuclear base, 40 personnel, plus those in doing normal policing duties that were called law enforcement, which may be anywhere from 6 to 10 people per shift. 365 days a year, 24/7. It was a nuclear base. That's what I'd worked on, similar numbers. All right? But we found out during the course of the book that the afternoon shift that should have been off at 11 o'clock on at least one night was held over because things were happening in the forest and they wanted people there in case for whatever reason. So that means there were in excess of 80 to 90 security police held over, working effectively. The afternoon shift effectively worked a double shift. And they weren't relieved until 5, 6 in the morning. They should have been off at 11 o'clock. So that's significant. This is absolutely sensational. We find from 3 witnesses military witnesses that I talked to, that routinely all the radio channels that the security police used, and there were at least 3, probably 4, but at least 3, were routinely recorded on reel-to-reel audio. So you think about the amount of evidence that would be on those tapes in terms of conversations and things that were happening. We'd be able to have a perfect chronological download of everything. I've never heard Colonel Holt admit to the fact that it was reel-to-reel. I've never heard Colonel Williams, before he died, the base commander, say that they were routinely recorded, but 3 military witnesses, including Sergeant Adrian Bustinza, the guy that said that he was in the field with Warren, he said it. Because he got sent them anonymously. He got sent on one of the nights he was involved, and he was not involved in one night. What's emerged from talking to me is it was 2 successive nights he'd had involvement, which we didn't know until I spoke to him. All right? Routinely recorded. Now, where is that evidence now? Christ, wouldn't that be exciting? To replay these nights, these controversial nights. Nobody ever admits. So that is entirely new. Now, significantly, in the run-up to the late December events, I came across events that had been out there on social media, on Facebook, but rarely noted. Nobody had ever really referenced them in books or anything. But I thought, well, actually, these cases are important because they tell a run-up. You know, because people still talk about the lighthouse if you're a skeptic, but you're not going to do that if you're having regular cases. Well, it can't all be the lighthouse. It's a very clever lighthouse, that. All right? So basically, there were 3 important precursor cases that happened earlier in the year. One in February 1980, another in July 1980, and another in November 1980. And the first one involved an airman, but she was a woman. And I said, airwoman. She said, no, they still call me an airman. Okay. Obviously different times, we couldn't do that now. But yeah, airman Laurie Rayfelt, she said that she was parked up in a military vehicle by the Eastgate at the end, actually on the base, RAF Woodbridge, by the end of the runway, and it was night shift, and they see an object coming towards them, a bright light, and they think, okay, there's just a plane coming in, Now, if you worked in a military environment, what would happen is when the plane got that close, the runway lights would come up so the plane could land, and off it went and got parked up. Now, she's expecting the runway lights to come on, but they don't. And she's thinking, that's a bit odd. And it gets closer and closer, and eventually, cutting a long story short, the object stops, which planes don't, and then suddenly it divides into 3 separate objects that then start making zigzag patterns like a ping pong ball, which we can't do, those angular turns, and then they just disappear. Disappear in a blink of an eye. So that was an important February case. And then in July, this guy, Michael Stacey Smith, he had a sighting where he was actually inside the perimeter of RAF Woodbridge, close to the East Gate, and he was near one of what's called hardened aircraft shelters, where they house the aircraft to protect them, and they're like supposed to be nuclear proof and whatever. But anyway, he's near one of them, and he goes out to relieve himself for a week, and as he does so, just outside the perimeter fence, which is very close by, he sees a glowing red beach ball size object just silently at about 4 feet high moving outside the perimeter fence, as you would. He then calls for backup because he's thinking, what the hell is that? Is he thinking it's Russian or Soviet or whatever? But anyway, he calls for backup, and 2 people come running out. One of them's a sergeant, another one's an airman, and the airman goes running towards the fence, towards this glowing beach ball, which is outside of the fence. He's there in his defensive position with an M60. If you've ever seen John J. Rambo, yeah, and that big heavy machine gun, that's what the M60 is. And he had that, and he's training on it, he's cocked it. He's thinking, I don't know what the hell this is, I'm guarding nuclear weapons here. And he's cocked his weapon, he admits to cocking his weapon, which is an important thing, because you don't do that unless you're really perceived threat. So he cocked his weapon, and he said to me, when I interviewed him, he said, if that airman had gone and that object had done anything, I would have opened fire on this beach ball size object, whatever it was. So that's his sighting. That's pertinent. Beach ball size objects are regularly seen throughout the Rendlesham Forest Incidents. Sometimes small beach ball size, other times the size of a car. Sometimes triangular objects, sometimes just bigger spheres. So, the last one is Steve Wagner. And I thought I'd give you a bit of realism. I'm going to put my glasses on for this. I'm going to read you a little bit from his account, because it's a good one. And because, like, I'm a dedicated researcher, I've even put the paper there to the right page. He said, okay, and it's not the right page, it is. There we go. And so that Michael Stacey Smith in November, he says this: a large orb, reddish orange in colour and roughly the size of a large beach ball, very similar to what Michael Stacey Smith did, rose from the sparse trees behind a mound, he calls it a berm, American language, and moved into the alpha area. Well, the alpha area is interesting, because this in the forest, this is near to the nuclear weapons storage area. It's about 300 metres away on RAF Bentwaters. So this is not in the forest, but nobody tells you about this case. But it's important because it's less than 300 metres from the most securely guarded place on the twin bases. And it moved into the Alpha area, which is 300 metres away, at which time I almost freaked out, because thinking, what the hell is this? Are we getting attacked? His colleague Labroucherie was now able to see it and babbled over the radio about the area being penetrated. Well, there's an object you can't explain in a really secure area. The orb hovered briefly over each of the A-10s. There was a flight lane of A-10 tank buster aircraft. So these were the top aircraft at that time, A-10s. And the damn thing was within arm's reach of these aircraft. When Chaz and I finally got somewhat close to it, it moved outside the fence line at an unbelievable speed. They move like that. Blink of an eye, can be on the horizon, like that lady described this morning. It rose to about 30, 40 feet off the ground, split into 3 separate objects, orbs, and then in a blinding flash, gone. How very reminiscent to what Laurie Rayfelt had seen. The aircraft coming in, it wasn't an aircraft, it stops, divides into three, and they all disappear. So I just thought that was a very telling account. Now, nobody talks about these precursor cases in any documentary that's ever been made. Do you not think they're relevant to telling the story of Rendlesham? That this wasn't just a one-off series of events? It's quite clearly suggesting that the base was being surveilled for a period of time, at least. And there were other incidents. These cases give the late December cases context, because they're not random. They're more of a pattern. Steve Longero, interesting guy. Law enforcement career, Air Force career, 30 years. Very similar to my background. A stand-up guy. I met him, I brought him over for my own conference in 2018. And he got so fed up of seeing Larry Warren get castigated by all these people, including Colonel Hall, including Jim Pennison, including John Burroughs to a degree, all dismissing his account. He said, I was there, I saw UFOs, and I saw Larry Warren on the night I was involved. And I said to him, well, how do you know Larry Warren? He says, I was on the same training course with him. Well, that's interesting. I said, were you mates? He said, not really. He said, but he was on my intake. Now, having been in the Air Force, my intake was 47 strong. And by the end of our basic training, I knew all the names, but I won't call them friends. Maybe half a dozen that I'd regularly socialised with. But you'd know the name. And when he was interviewed by me, again, transatlantic phone call, he said, I was on the same course. He said, when I was in the forest by the staging area, where all the vehicles were, he says, I saw Larry Warren. And I was pleased to see him because he was a face I recognised. Hey, what's going on, mate? And you would have that kinship with somebody who'd been on your course. Natural kinship. You wouldn't be a best mate of his or whatever, but he was saying, I knew him. And I was pleased to see him because I'm thinking, what the hell is happening? Jesus, what's going on? So he was pleased, and that's a great recognition factor as a detective. Why do you remember? Because I was pleased to see him, because he was somebody I knew. I didn't know anybody else. That's a great recognition factor. But interestingly, this guy then goes on to say, I was inside the nuclear weapons storage area at RAF Bentwaters when a UFO shone a beam down into the nuclear bunkers. We'd had stories. We'd never had confirmation. Now we have a direct witness, Steve Longero. Absolutely stand-up guy. I put my house on him. Regular guy. 30-year policing experience, a very stand-up guy. He then says that the UFO does this. It's by the fence line. It shines a beam down into the bunkers. What was called the hot row was a series of bunkers that was approximately 200 metres long, housing lots of different metallic front bunkers, like in the picture. And the object went like this. Zoom, 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 all the way down, as if it was scanning the contents of what was underground. It was a deliberate pendulum. It was a scan, an inspection of what was housed underneath. And the nuclear weapons were not stored inside, they were underground. Yeah? The doors are only there to be lowered down to underground facilities. I remember what Colonel Holt had told me. More nuclear weapons at RAF Bentwaters than anywhere else in Europe. So why do UFOs turn up? Well, we'll talk about that. But I think it's because of the amount of nuclear weapons. The illegal amount. They were allowed to keep them. I found a document that says, and it's in the book, it's listed 25 nuclear weapons held at RAF Bentwaters. It was a nuclear base. But it was the amount. And they broke all the armament agreements. And it was the time of the Cold War, and we nearly went into a Third World War. Why? Because, and again, this is context. Why do UFOs turn up then? Why is it doing a scan? Because at the time of this event, and it's not usually told, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops were massing on the Polish borders because of the rise of the shipyard workers in Gdansk under Lech Wałęsa, who went on to become president. It was still a part of the Soviet Union. The Russians, the Soviet Union, if you remember your history, for those old enough, they'd already gone into Czechoslovakia and put down a rebellion with the tanks, rolled in, quashed it. Hungary did exactly the same, quashed it. And it looked like they were going to do it again. So at the time of these late December events, hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops massing on the Polish borders, and it looked like they're going to roll in to try to quell it. But there was also something else that was going on that was a really powder keg as well, and that was the 52 Americans held by the Iranians, the Iranian hostage crisis. So you can imagine the Middle East, the powder keg at the best of times. So you've got this possible Soviet aggression going into Poland, and then you've also got a powder keg of a hostage situation with American hostages. So that's context. So maybe UFOs turn up because at a time of world instability, they kind of recognize that there's something there that shouldn't be there, that's breaking all the rules. And for those of you who are not aware, there's a huge correlation going back to the 1940s all around the world between UFOs being seen in nuclear power plants, weapon storage areas, nuclear aircraft carriers, things like that. They're very interested in nuclear weapons. Why? We're not sure, but it invites the theory that they don't want to see us destroy ourselves. Can I prove that? No. But there is a real strong correlation. So when he told me that, I thought, wow, we now have a named witness. As soon as this comes out, Colonel Holt says, no, he's telling a lot of rubbish. Starts attacking him. Why should this guy lie? And we'll come back to that. So if it's not in the memorandum, keep this in mind. If it's not in the memorandum, we attack everything else. This wasn't in the memorandum, so we'll attack it. So he then goes on to say, well, I was like supernumerary. I'd just come on shift, and I was walking around inside a weapons storage area with an experienced airman. And then when the UFO had shone the beam down, it then shot off towards Rendlesham Forest. And he could hear on the radio that other security police officers were tracking its movements towards the forest. He then hears that people are being transferred into the forest. And because he was like doubled up, he was new on shift, they said, you can go to the forest as well. So you're getting taken out of the weapons storage area. Now you get in the back of that truck, you're going out in the forest. They wanted bodies, for want of a better phrase. They wanted people in the forest because something was happening in the forest. So he gets taken from the storage area, the weapons storage area, and he goes out to the forest. And he says, when I got to the forest, this is before any Colonel Holt turns up. And the person who was out there telling everybody about the first night landings was Jim Penniston. Well, that's interesting because Jim Penniston's supposedly on leave. He got 6 days after his first night event. So why would Jim Penniston be out there in the forest when he's got a 6-day pass? But he's adamant. He says that it was Jim Penniston that was out there, and he was showing 10 to 15 other colleagues that he'd arrived with in the forest. There's the first night landing depressions, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, before that happened, they see a UFO in the forest themselves. So he has another encounter of a UFO whizzing around in the sky and low between the trees. Nobody had ever talked about that. It's an entirely new incident. Okay, and he also said that senior officers then turn up, including Colonel Holt. Well, according to Colonel Holt, he was only involved in one night, and it doesn't seem to be the night, this night. But several people named Holt in the incident in the field with Larry Warren that he'd admitted to in 1985. Now, this is them on the same training course. That's Larry Warren. That's Steve Lungera. So you know him, but he wasn't a mate. But he got so fed up of all Larry Warren, people saying, he wasn't there, you're making it up. You're taking Adrian Bustinza's stories, these come forward. Didn't have to do that. He didn't have to put himself through the grief that he got because it upset those that wanted to change the narrative and rule Warren out. This is arguably one of the most sensational tales in the book. We didn't have a direct witness. We knew that something had happened to her. The existing story was another woman, Laurie Bowen, had been at the East Gate. She'd seen a red glowing object drop into the forest near to the East Gate. She'd report it on her Century Books telephone, and the first person who responded to investigate was this lady, who was a young female officer, shift officer, very popular apparently, doing really well. And she happened to be on mobile patrol coming from RAF Bentwaters on the rural back roads go into RAF Woodbridge, and she said, I'll respond to that. Now, she's obviously not thinking UFOs are real or anything like that. So she goes, and then the next thing that people went on the record and give statements about is they hear us over the radio going, Bobby, Bobby, help, help! I'm not making this up. She was terrified. Bobby, Bobby, she's talking to Sergeant Robert Ball. Bobby, Bobby, help, help! And she's frantic. Something had happened, but we didn't know what. And the story was closed like that for years. And then Michael Stacey Smith, this guy, in a passing comment to me about his earlier sighting, in the precursor cases in July, he made like a throwaway comment. I said, you knew Bonnie Tamplin. Do you know what happened to her? And he went, well, I know some of it. And I said, well, tell me more. And it turns out he's a direct witness to part of what happened to her. So we didn't know. So this is absolutely new in the book. And cutting a long story short, he says that he's at RAF Bentwaters, and then suddenly he gets told, go to the back gate of RAF Bentwaters, which is called the Butler gate. Go open it up, there's some vehicles going to go out. And it's like urgent. Get down there quick, open up the gate. Don't know what it is. Opens up the gate, three or four vehicles, police vehicles, turn out, go off in a convoy, like in an emergency. They're putting speed on. Don't know why. A few minutes later, he then sees a vehicle come back in, and it's been driven by Sergeant Robert Ball, Bobby Ball, who she'd been screaming out for. And he sees him driving, and his front seat passenger is Bonnie Tamplin, the black female officer. And she is dishevelled. She's not wearing a beret. She's absolutely distraught. He doesn't speak to her, but he can clearly see that something dramatic had happened to her. Off they go through the gate. 10 minutes later, open up the gate again. A vehicle, her vehicle that she'd been driving, is being driven in. But the vehicle had sustained roof damage, as if consistent with being rolled onto its roof. It's still drivable. He sees that. So he's a direct witness to a damaged vehicle. He's thinking, what the hell's gone on? He then closes the gate and he speaks to a sergeant who was a friend of his. And the sergeant says, if you swear never to reveal my name, I'll tell you what happened to her, or the account that had emerged. And he said, okay. And to his word, he didn't tell me. But I've no reason to disbelieve Michael Stacey Smith. What, why? What's the point of him making this up? And he said what happened to her is she's driving on the country road, a British rural country road, when a UFO, like a beach ball size object, the size of a car, starts travelling alongside of her at hedgerow height. So can you imagine, you're just driving your car, she'd be terrified. She was so terrified that she lost control of the vehicle, crashed into a ditch, rolled the vehicle. Here's the thing. When she clambers out, the object has stopped and is hovering above her, close to her, within a few feet. She is so distressed that she gets her weapon and starts discharging several rounds at it, at which point it then shoots off in the blink of an eye. All covered up by the US Air Force. The sergeant admitted that all the rounds that she discharged, she had fired a weapon, she had lost a weapon, she left it at the scene, it was recovered, all the rounds were put back, so there was nothing missing, it was all covered up, didn't go down in any records, no blotters, no daily occurrence books, nothing at all. So here we are, this poor woman run off the road effectively by a UFO, and you've never heard about it until now. Now that should be a front page story, do you not think? In the context of this famous sighting, where it has had new front page headlines. I've given it to the press, they don't want to run with it. They'd rather talk about me doing the walk in the forest. Because that's something new. They're not bothered about the facts. They're not bothered about telling you the real story. But I wanted to bring this book out to show you that you're not being told everything. Yeah? And the only way you can do it is slip it out there. Okay? So, that's what happened to her. And I have no reason to doubt Michael Stacey Smith. She was apparently shipped back to the United States within 6 days, never to be heard of again. Now, I do know the fact that she got out of the Air Force quickly. The story goes cold after that. I know that she's living in Europe. She married a European. I know which country she's living in. I know some of the relatives through social media. I've contacted them hoping that she'll speak, but she don't want to. They just don't respond. And who can blame them? Who can blame them? But that, I'd love to speak to her. And I hope that if she ever gets a copy of this book, that she might think, well, all these years later, it might be the time to exercise the ghost. But I couldn't blame her if she didn't. But can you imagine how frightening that is? So, Adrian Bustinza, this mythical guy who was religious, found it very difficult, who was traumatized. I sent him a copy of the book, and he read it, and he said, I found it very hard to go through. He says, but his comments, I don't know if I can read them up there. Change the camera angle, I'll read it. I consider, right, so this is what he said about the book, my book. I will say this, the information is spot on and your research has gone far beyond all of the others, and I'm so happy that I was able to open up to you and assist you with your research and investigation that is second to none. You have it as your accounts from those involved, and how you have managed to put it all together has almost definitively defined the actual events of those encounters on the separate nights. You have surgically pieced together all the events together. I am grateful and thank you. Which was a lovely endorsement. He is a very reluctant witness. But he didn't have to say that. He could have said anything. It's his account of reading the book. But I thought that was a lovely thing for him to say. It endorsed what I'd been trying to say. In his account, he's got the biggest chapter in the book. It's about 100 pages. Not about 80 pages, sorry. But when you read that, when he's been interrogated and threatened with his life, bear in mind he was a sergeant, he was disgusted. He was given a hard time, interrogation. You saw this, you saw this, you saw Lighthouse. No, I didn't. His bullets are cheap. Everything that Warren had said, he said. And he said, I was taken to an underground facility under the photo lab at RAF Bentwaters, and I was led down this long corridor underground, and I was given a hard time. And he said, I felt so disgusted that there I am, a sergeant in the Air Force. And he said, I signed up to protect my country, and here I am being treated like a criminal for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He said, I felt so gutted, I wanted to go AWOL. He was so disgusted, but his family were being surveilled, his dad worked for the government, there was a lot of stuff that happened to him. And there's lots of stuff that comes out in the book that I don't have time to go into. But it's palpable when that particular section, where he's just in free flow talking about his interrogation, is one of, if not the most powerful sequence in the entire book. It's like one page where it's just no interruptions, and he's on about, and it's palpable, the fear and the disgust that he felt. It's palpable. So, really good guy. 34 years policing experience, because he retired, he then went into working with offenders. So he then went into like the prison service on the rehabilitation side. He's still doing that now. He's retired from he was a sheriff, and blah, blah, blah. So an absolutely stand-up guy. And he is arguably the most important witness, other than the original military whistleblower, Larry Warren, because you wouldn't have a case without him, who's come forward because he links to this other landing. And when it finally got in the interview about him, for the first 3.5 hours of that 4.5-hour transatlantic call, he didn't mention the Larry Warren. I'm exhausted. It's through the night. So it's like 5, 6 in the morning for me, and I'm naturally getting tired. Even though I've got a buzz and adrenaline, when you're actually asking questions, it's very tiring mentally. And so I eventually did what I didn't want to do. I wanted to lead him. But I said to him, I said, look, I'm getting really tired now, but you haven't mentioned Larry Warren yet. And I said, there's a lot of controversy, basically. And it's audio recorded. And I said, and I set him off telling him about a 1984 interview that he'd had with this Larry Fawcett. And I said, you said all these things, and you said Warren was there. And he says, Warren was there. Oh, that was good. So you're confirming to me that Larry Warren was there. He said, yeah, he was closer to it than I was. But he said, it wasn't the whole night. It was another night. He'd never ever said that. And I went, what? He said, that was another night. I said, so you're telling me this is a completely different night to the Holt night? when he's out there that you were involved in? He says, yes. And that kind of makes sense, because a lot of people have speculated that there was maybe a fourth night, because some of the events didn't seem to jar together. Well, it makes more sense if there's four. And he was saying to me that he was involved in a second UFO incident. And it might not be the next day, but it's within a couple of days. But it could be consecutive. But the point was, he was remembering that Warren was there, that it was being filmed, that Warren was actually closer to it. So it's there, it's done and dusted. He was there. So anybody that tells you otherwise, they're not interested in the facts. Okay? So this guy is an absolutely linking guy. This has come out, and I believe Colonel Holt has said, no, that didn't happen. Denied that Warren was there, even now. So he's not listening to this evidence. The people that want to suppress this case and keep the existing narrative do not want you to know about this guy's recent interview with me, because he links it all together and confirms this corroboration that the base commander of 12,000 people was there. He saw entities. He didn't call them entities because he was so reluctant to admit that because of his religious beliefs. He said, I saw silhouettes, some kind of life form. He phrased it that way. Warren had said he'd seen 3 floating entities beside the shimmering craft in a silent face-off with the base commander. So from me to you, 10 feet away, having some silent communication, a face-off. Sounds incredible, but he corroborated all of it, pretty much. Okay, but everybody's perception is slightly different. And he had another incident with John Burroughs, the first night, one of the people involved in the first night. And he said that at one point, after, it gets complicated, but suffice to say that he mentions entities again in the context of John Burroughs being engulfed in light. And he said, to the left of John Burroughs, who's 6'6", built like a brick outhouse, on the left, in this bright white light, there was something smaller, a silhouette of something. And then in the right side of John, so the one on either side, there was some kind of figure there, some kind of life form. So that's, again, another incident nobody talks about. He revealed an incident that never happened. He said that before Holt got there, which is totally against the Holt night, he said on the Holt night, he got back to the forest because he had a roving patrol. He was called the NCOIC. And basically, he had a roving... So when they needed lights for the forest, Holt had said to him, go get me more light hauls, these big portable generators. Okay, so he'd go out, bring some more back to the forest. They wouldn't work. That's cutting a long story short. But suffice to say that he said on one occasion, Holt's talking at the staging area, and then he's told to go be part of a 20-strong team of security officers that do a line search. If ever you've seen a TV police programme where they're looking for a knife on a field, you'll see a line of police officers going like this. And they've got sticks, and they're all looking in a line. Well, he did that as part of the forest. And he said that at that point, they have another UFO encounter with multiple objects. Nobody ever mentioned that before. It's an entirely new event. 20 officers, nobody's ever talked about that. So were any of the witnesses subjected to interrogations? And the answer is yes. Did any of the military witnesses involved in the RFI suffer biological health effects? And the answer is yes. And there's one more. Colonel Williams. Who told me that? Grant Cameron. If you've ever heard of the international lecturer, Grant Cameron, he's well known for doing his work about presidents and UFOs. Canadian researcher. He was at my home. I brought him for a conference, and he stayed at my home for a day or so. And he said that he was aware of a secret program where military witnesses, predominantly military witnesses, were being interviewed by Dr. Kit Green, which was mentioned earlier by Tina Bird. And the majority were military witnesses, and they'd suffered health effects for being in close proximity to UFOs. Well, bear in mind that Holt had said that Williams wasn't there, although he'd admitted it to Ray Boucher in 1985. He's vehemently said Colonel Williams, the base commander, wasn't there. Well, he says, yeah, there were 3 people, and it's in the book, the transcript's in the book, where I video him saying this, and he said, yeah, there's Jim Penniston suffered health effects in regards to Rendlesham, John Burroughs had health effects, and Colonel Williams. It's like, oh, Colonel Williams? He's not supposed to be there. But he would be if he was 10 feet away in that field. So again, another subtle indication that the story you're being given is not quite right. This man was the most important person in the US. He was the head of the 8th Air Force in Europe, US Air Force. He turns up at the base within days of the incident, and apparently he walks away with loads of evidence. We're not quite sure what evidence. But why would that man go there if nothing had happened and it was just a lighthouse? He'd already been there earlier, a few months earlier, for a routine inspection. Why would he go there over Christmas? You don't get officers coming out on Christmas. It's a different world. If you're an officer, it's a different world to an airman. Anybody who's been in the military will know that the officers get away with blue murder. So this is the base commander, and that's his name at the bottom there. A lot of people try to say, oh, no, it was Colonel Conrad who was the base commander. No, he was the guy in charge of 12,000 people. And he said something that was really interesting. He'd totally downplayed, no, I had no knowledge of really what occurred. And a few people, James Fox had interviewed him, the video documentary filmmaker for one of his earlier documentaries. And over the period of my research, it kind of came back to me lots of times. And he's captured by the side of his car. He's probably just had a round of golf, and James Fox has gone up to him and said, can I ask you a couple of questions? Yeah, okay. And he basically says, there were a lot of things that came out with the memo that we weren't prepared for, and, you know, shouldn't have come out. But once it was out, we had to kind of deal with it. And basically, that came back to stick in my throat lots of times. Because what he was basically saying is, once that memorandum had come out, the Air Force had totally denied it for 2.5 years. And then that accidentally comes out, and it's on US Air Force notepaper. He couldn't deny it anymore, so we knew that there were 2 incidents. But if nothing else was in that memorandum, they would debunk it. So he had no choice but to say, yeah, the memorandum's real. But yeah, there were things that come out that kind of led a life of their own. And what he was basically saying, reading between the lines, is, well, it wasn't supposed to come out. We had to admit to that. You found us out, but I'm not going to admit to anything else. So all these other incidents that happened to the airmen, they just get attacked because there's a narrative that's going on. Just to put you into context there, that's an aerial photograph of the hot row. That's where the UFO is shining a beam down, all down there. There was the guy in the main tower, which was there, a guy called Rick Bobo. I spoke to him and interviewed him, and he said, and we did a recreation of the Photoshop picture, he said he saw a UFO hanging over the forest there at the end of the hot row on one of the nights of the encounters, but he's not sure which. But he also said he saw a gigantic UFO stationary above the Woodbridge, and he says then smaller objects went down into the forest. He's the only person that says that. These are some of the people you never get to hear about, but have made occasional appearances in documentaries. This is a guy called Ray Gullias. He basically said he saw life forms out there. This is Munro Nevels, who was part of the group that was with Colonel Holt on what's called the Holt Night, which is the 3rd night. This is the famous Robert Ball. Now, I think he's involved in several other incidents, but he only went on camera once as himself, and that was in the early 90s. Never been seen since. That's Rick Bober, the guy in the tower that said he'd seen something at the end of the hot row. This is the woman, Laurie Bowen, who reported the incident going down when Bonnie Tamplin, the red ball going into the forest, she was the one that started that. And this is a poor picture, but it's a guy called Zimmer, and he was a major, and he was the head of, he was high up in the police, right? He's rumoured to have been out there on at least one of the nights, but nobody ever talks about him. So, anybody seen this person before? Nick Pope. Nick Pope has aligned himself to this case, and it's not by coincidence, in my opinion. There's a chapter on Nick Pope. It's all fact-based on documents that are revealed from the MOD. He didn't run any department. He did not run anything. He worked in a one-person office, his own office. He was basically handling minor correspondence. If somebody reported a UFO, it was sent down on a fax or a telex or whatever of the means of the day, and he would get it and evaluate it, put it away. He was not a trained investigator, and in released documents, he was 24 years old when he worked at the UFO desk. Nobody runs an MOD department at the age of 24 in the MOD. So he was there between the ages of 24 and 26. In his actual duties, and the way he got paid, he actually writes a letter to Peter Robbins, as it turns out, in 1994, when he left the desk in July of 1994. And he basically said, I'm only paid for 20% of my time to UFOs. The rest of it was just admin stuff, not UFO related at all. So if we work that out on a simple basis of 40-hour week, 8 hours a week, so 1 day a week, he did UFO correspondence, which was largely rubbish correspondence with poorly filled in pro forma reports. Occasionally there'd be a pilot report, occasionally there'd be a police officer report, and he might make a few phone calls. He was not a trained investigator, he never ran anything. The guy vastly overplayed his part, has become a multimillionaire and become the go-to guy in the world. Built on a lie. Good luck to him. But I couldn't have done that, because he has actively said, I ran the UFO desk. I've got documentaries where he said, I ran. If you go to his website, he said, I ran the UFO department. He didn't run anything. But he's the top guy in the world. All the documentaries ever done there. All right? So he is part of the story that controls the narrative with Holt, Pennison and Burroughs and Nick Pope. I personally believe, read the chapter in the book if you've not got it, but I think I offer a compelling reasons why he was planted within the UFO community to be embedded within the US lecture scene that is literally every month during the summer, basically to control this narrative. And it turns out, in a little interview that I found, believe it or not, on Wikipedia, under his page, on a little link, and I think it's still there, I watched this little interview, and he'd already said his dad had was a scientist and had worked for the MOD, and his dad had got him interested in joining the MOD. Well, anyway, I've often thought that he was a plant. And I watched this interview, and I didn't expect to hear what I heard. But it turns out his dad just wasn't any scientist within the MOD. He was the top scientist. He was next to the Minister of Defence. Now that person's going to have a lot of power. When Nick Pope went public with his first book, which isn't a bad book, Open Skies, Closed Minds, 2 months before that book was published, he appeared on BBC Two's top political programme, Newsnight, which was then live. And he was interviewed by arguably the top politician interviewer of the day, Peter Snow. And Peter saw, and this is 2 months before his book out, and they've already got parts of his book being read by an actor. And I'm thinking, how the hell does a first-time author on a quirky subject like UFOs get on to the top political programme of the day? And I could never understand that until I watched that video. Because he must have had help and placement. And it worked, because that immediately positioned himself as this, oh my God, we've got somebody believing from the inside. And the UFO community went, yes, hallelujah. Especially in America where they do that. And they welcomed him with open arms. Oh, come and join us, Nick. You've turned. Ever since he got positioned within the UFO community, he's denied that UFOs are alien, ever since. And I was with him. I know him. I've done documentaries with him. And I'm always very careful around him, because I don't trust him. Inherently, as a detective, you can suss out people. And when I've said, look, I personally think you're a plant within the UFO community, he went, over dinner, as close as 3 feet away, he went. That's my story. I can't prove that, but that's what he did. And when I was with him at what's called the Citizens' Hearings in Washington, D.C. in 2013, where lots of top researchers from around the world gave evidence, I was giving evidence about police officers. He was giving evidence basically about his MOD pass. He was asked the question by one of the senators, a former congressman. And the congressman, I'm thinking, what are you going to say to this, Nick? Because he's totally dissed the subject ever since. And he said, so Nick, you worked in the MOD, you ran the MOD. And he says, so you pretty much know the subject. Yeah. So here we are, we've got all these witnesses saying it's ET. What do you think, Nick? And he went, well, and I'm paraphrasing, he went, well, I'm not quite convinced. He says, there's some interesting sightings, but I'm not quite convinced. And he says, in a roundabout way, I realise that's a bit embarrassing, but yeah, I'm not convinced. So there he was on a big stage in front of a former senator, a former presidential candidate, that senator, Mike Gravel, and 5 former congressmen and women who've got something like 80 years collective public service in high office. And he's saying, I basically don't know. Yet in 1996, when he got on Newsnight, 2 months before his book comes out, so Nick, what do you think it is, says Peter Snow. He says, oh, some of them UFOs are definitely extraterrestrial. Can't be explained. What a deviation away. So he positioned himself beautifully to be welcomed. He got his green card within 3 months because he married an American lady he met off the internet. Good luck to him. But within 3 months, he's got his green card. He's embedded in the US circuit. He's been there ever since. And why was he there? I think to control the Rendlesham case, along with the others. And he's done a beautiful job. But read the book, because it's interesting. It's not me attacking him, not being personal. It's the facts, and the facts are relayed in the book. Documents relate all the same stuff. Okay, so what about the binary codes? Anybody heard of the binary code download? Supposedly Jim Penniston, 30 years later, says at the 30th anniversary Woodbridge conference, I touched the craft, and when I touched the craft, I had a download of information, 00s and 1s, didn't know what it was, and then the next day I felt compelled to write it down at home, 001, 110, 001, 110. He wrote pages. He didn't tell anybody about that for 30 years. And then suddenly at the 30th anniversary conference, he comes out with this. So the audience are a bit like sceptical. But he actually tripped himself up because he actually said contradictory things, but completely went over the head of the audience. He actually said that he disclosed the binary codes to Linda Moulton Howe in 1994 when he'd done a little job with her, but he completely lost in the audience. He then did a show within days called the Angela Joyner Radio Show. And he said that there were 6 pages of binary code, and then he said it was 8 pages. And then on other shows within days, he was saying it was 12 pages, it was 11 pages. Well, if it was such an incredible event that had only happened to you once in your life, I think I'd know how many pages I wrote now. You just think that would stick in your head because it's such an amazing thing. Little things like this send up loads of red flags. I spoke with his co-author, Gary Osborne, who he wrote his book with, UFO Enigma, and basically Gary Osborne admitted to me in a social media dialogue that it's a standalone account. There's nobody corroborating this story, right? And so he admitted that in this, and it's all in the book, in the transcripts. And I said, so it's basically a standalone. There's nobody corroborating it, and you're asking the world to believe that all these coordinates around the world and that beings from the future are coming back, which is entirely possible, but is there any evidence? I look at evidence, and there's no corroboration to that at all. So I just write in the book that basically it's a standalone account. It's like saying, I'm Jesus. Then you'd say, well, prove that you're Jesus. It's a standalone account. I'm not saying it can't be true. I'm not saying you can't have had a download. I do believe people can have downloads of information on various things. But I find his story worrying because of the inconsistencies. As a detective, it throws up red flags. That's all I can say. Little interview there where he's asked that very question. Let's see if we can find it. Right. Now, this is not pertinent. Now, this is a 2002 incident. When you touched these symbols with your hand, did you get any images in your mind? Surely he's retired. Surely that was the right question to answer it properly and say, yeah, well, actually, I did have a strange incident. No, but I did have a sensation. The fabric of the craft was warmer than the air temperature. The air temperature that night was 31, 32 Fahrenheit. The craft was quite a bit warmer. Surely that was the golden opportunity to reveal those mine records. But he didn't. Why not? He didn't, he wasn't truthful with the audience when he did. There's a video of this 30th anniversary, and it's 2 hours long, and the guy did it. He's not a great cameraman, but he captured that moment in history. And when you watch that back, as I did, and broke it down and did a transcript and pick out the key bits to evaluate, it's very telling. A sensational news story came in from this guy. Nobody had ever heard of him. And then he approaches me not long before the book was due to be published, maybe a year, 18 months before. And it turns out that actually he's made a mistake with the date. Because in the book, it's part of the December events, because he thought it was December 1980. But it turns out it's late December 1979, a year before. So this, in effect, becomes a precursor case. But what he says, and this is sensational, so Miles, am I happy to continue?
Yeah.
Right, because you want to hear this.
Yeah.
Never been told before on stage like this. Entirely new. He said, he's not a security policeman, so this is good in itself. This is further corroboration that there were UFO events. He was a crew chief, and he was working on repairing an F4 Phantom. Now, a lot of people have said the Phantoms weren't there then, but there was 3 still left. And I know from my Air Force days that when I got to Honington, there was still a few Buccaneers there was still a few Hunters there. All the other squadrons had gone. So you do get, and they had to be gone by, it turns out now, January 1980, these repairs. So he was working on an aircraft there, just inside the perimeter, and that's an aircraft shelter there. So he's working underneath an A-10 Phantom jet, F4 Phantom, and it's the night shift, and suddenly he feels a shudder, and he's underneath it, and he feels like something had walked, or just juddered the aircraft. And just before he comes out from being underneath, like the bomb door bears, he then hears like a scratching noise on a canopy. He comes out, he climbs up a little ladder to the canopy, and it was a brand new canopy. And there were 3 claw marks. Didn't see anything, but he said as he's looking at that, he then feels a second vibration from the end of the aircraft, as if something has jumped off the tail, the spine of the plane. So he notices that there are some kind of footprints in the moisture of the night air along the spine, as if something had gone from the cockpit area, walked along the spine, and then jumped off. Doesn't see what it is, but what he does see, after that second judder, is he sees the bushes moving. Don't see what it is, but he sees the bushes moving towards the perimeter fence. Now look where he is. If this works. Right. So he's there. The perimeter fence is just there. He says that he saw something rustling through the bushes as if it had gone through a hole in the fence and it was making its way through the trees. Now the forest is not like it was, but then the trees were much closer. These are all new trees, but there were trees very close to the east gate. And he said something, didn't see what it was moving towards it. And then it gets even more bizarre. He said that this is where the east gate is. He said then he hears 2 shots. 2 gunshots. He hits the ground, as you would, under the plane. And the shots are being fired from the east gate, where there was a security policeman there. Not routinely manned, by the way. The east gate was not routinely manned. Forgive the phrase. Right? And so he hears 2 shots, he hits the ground, then he hears 2 more shots, and then he hears somebody, presumably the security police officer, shout, "Get away, get away." He then sees another object scurrying through the trees. Doesn't see what it is, but something's rustling in the bushes, and guess what? A UFO is coming down vertically into a clump of trees, which is not the way it is now. This is new trees. And so this is less than 150 metres from the east gate. So nobody had ever heard of this story. And he said that UFOs descending and you've got something rustling through the bushes through there. something is rustling through the bushes from the east gate. And then, because of the shotgun, because the gunshots fired, his crew chief turns up and he says, get in the vehicle, get in the vehicle. He said, I thought you'd been abducted. I thought you were the fifth one. Now, I've seen all of his military records. There's no reason to think that this guy is making this up. What's he going to gain by coming forward? He's going to be labelled to ridicule and whatever. He's been interviewed once on the Unexplained show with Howard Hughes, if you ever watched that on a Sunday night. And Howard Hughes says, comes across a really nice, standard guy. And I've talked to him at length on video, via Zoom and Skype. A regular guy. Why is he going to make this up? And the only thing that he's got wrong was he thought that it was December 1980, because quite rightly he thought it must be a part of these incidents. But actually, when he's gone back after the book's release, he said, actually, I'm embarrassed. This is why. He said, well, I've checked my records. I left in early 1980. I said, well, that's no problem. It just means you're not part of the main collection, but you're throwing up more questions, because what you're saying is that there's this amazing incident in 1979, a year earlier. And a lot of people at Rendlesham, including Larry Warren, said it was as if something was expected. Maybe it wasn't a surprise. Maybe there was more knowledge, that there was some predetermined meet or whatever. We don't know. But some people have speculated that there was some kind of anticipation that something was going to happen over that Christmas period. And now when you hear about this story, it kind of gives it a bit of context. Exactly a year later, a year earlier, he'd had this experience. So a fantastic story, no reason to disbelieve it. Nick Pope, going back to Nick Pope, by the way, thinks that I should be arrested. Because what he's basically saying is I'm perpetrating a hoax on the UFO community by being involved in a documentary that's going to come out later this year. Well, why would I do that? Why would I put my reputation all on the line? Why would he interview all these people to make it all up? It's not my words, it's there. So what's his agenda to attack me like that? And he's not just done it once, he's done it several times. But we'll leave it at that. So, are there any credible explanations for the incidents that has occurred? Well, no, lighthouses don't fly. They never could. But this was perpetrated and put forward by the media. And it was so easy for them to do. So they must have been involved. How many incidents? 17 in the conclusions of the book. When you break it down, there were 17 different timed events. Not 2 or 3, 17 over the late December period. That had never been put together. The timeline is in the book. They're all there. And this was my mantra for writing the book. I have no friends to reward and no foes to punish. We're going to go where the facts take us. Facts are neither Republican nor Democratic. They are the facts. And that's what I've done with the book. I'm trying to get the facts out there. Whether it's picked up, it probably won't become a bestseller because people will not want to pick it up. But you are getting the opportunity to read about old interviews and stuff that should have been in documentaries in a way that nobody's ever given that. And the story's out now because you're going to read that book. You're going to go out there and say, look, this is all based on records. There's a reference to that. That's where that was done. It's all referenced. I'm not saying the story. I'm just giving you the facts. I take the sentiment out and I put out the facts because I think you deserve to have them. Thank you very much. That's the book. Unless the guy at the back watching the books has stolen them all, there's 10 left, if anybody wants them.
Thank you very much, Gary Heseltine. Give him another round of applause. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a heck of a ride, and I very much appreciate everybody for coming. Don't have my sheet of paper to read to all the good people who've helped to put this conference together, the volunteers, Claire and her friends, and the V and the wonderful food. And thank you for coming. It's been the whole point of this conference is to try and push boundaries, push levels, different opinions and things, and that's why the BASES project is here, to do that sort of thing. It's my little thing to do in life. Anyway, we are now behind schedule, and I would invite you to have a good time. safe home, and God bless. And my final word is, that's a wrap.